Let's go ahead and kick it off. Again, today's webinar is an introduction to developing and reclaiming screens. With us today, our guest is Keith Perkins, Technical Sales Manager at Saati. How's it going, Keith?
It's going very well, and thank you for the invitation. Good morning to everyone.
Great to have you, Keith. I mean, again, you bring a wealth of knowledge. How long have you been in the custom printing industry?
I started printing our own shirts in high school in the early 80s. I was blessed to go into production in the 85, 86 era. Spent 12 years in production and was recruited out to the sales and consulting side in 1997, and yet here I am today, still.
Wow, and how old is Saati?
I'm going to say Saati's somewhere in 85 to 88 years old. Can't recall exactly. I know they had a 75th anniversary about the second year I was here, and that's been 17 years ago. So I'm going to say they're pushing 90 years old, based in Applegentile, Italy, a very large, globally mesh manufacturer. They got into the emulsion and chemistry when they bought Majestec in 1991 here in the U.S., and that's how Saati made its presence into the U.S., was by purchasing Majestec and Dorn on the West Coast.
I mean, it should give anybody confidence whenever you're working with a company that's approaching 100 years old. They got to be doing something right.
Certainly, and I truly believe, we talk about this often, the sales reps that work for Saati, I don't believe anyone has less than 25 years experience. I would even push that to say closer to 30.
And that's valuable because when you meet with the shop, you can share your knowledge, and no shop is the same, right? I mean, there's a lot of different types of chemicals. There's a lot of different ways to screen print, a lot of different substrates and inks. And
very true. Yeah, you and I talked about this a little bit ago, that there's a reason why we have 80 plus emulsions and 33 different ink removers, and 12, 15 different emulsion removers, different haze removers, and different press washes. It all truly depends on what segment of the printing industry you're in. And each shop is a little different than the next one. They could be side by side on Main Street downtown and end up using different chemistry depending on the equipment they have and the inks they choose to print with.
And again, when we're talking about screen printing, it all starts with making a screen. So if you don't make the screen perfect, you're gonna battle it the entire time you're on press. So one could argue it is the most important part of screen printing because it's where it starts, and it's going to be an uphill battle or an impossible battle to win if you don't properly create your stencils, reclaim, and everything that essentially isn't fun. I mean, it's a lot more fun to be on press and be printing and kind of seeing the money come through. But reclaiming a screen, not exactly the most fun thing to do, but extremely important. As again, if you don't get all that emulsion out, or I mean, there's a number of problems and scenarios that we're going to go over that can again make the act of printing more difficult than it should be, or again, impossible.
So kudos, and I can share with you that the better screen maker you are, the easier the job will go up on the press and print the job and then go through the reclaim. So many shops are in such a hurry to go out and buy the printing equipment, the dryers, the flash unit, and get all this printing equipment, but they don't pay any attention to the proper pre-press area, which is where I've spent 30 plus years. The better screen you make, the easier it's going to go through the process. And so spend the time, do it correctly, and you'll thank us later.
And we're playing with a lot of chemicals. It's chemistry, and you need to respect chemistry. You can't. You're not going to beat chemistry. You're not going to beat Mother Nature, although it's not really the same thing. But if you're going to wash out a screen, and create your stencil, there's a reason it takes so much time to have the emulsion break down and so forth. You're just not going to beat the chemistry behind it. And one way that you can make a lot of this a little bit easier is to buy some of the automated equipment. I mean, there's been a lot of groundbreaking technology over the past 15, 20 years. You first had the computer to screen, and then I'm really excited to talk about the laser to screen because that seems like truly groundbreaking technology for those larger shops to be able to create that perfect stencil. So let's kick it off by introducing the screen making room and the reclaim area. Now, in my shop, I am one of those garage basement type print shops where I don't have the room and I'm not doing so much production that I have two separate areas. I kind of have it all in one. I'm that small startup guy when it comes to screen printing. So behind me, you'll see we have the washout sink. And a perfect scenario, I would have two different sinks, one for making screens and one for reclaiming. Reclaiming is very dirty. You have a lot of ink flying around, a lot of emulsion being kicked off. And when you're making a screen, you don't want any of that to potentially come up onto the new screen that you're about to take into production. So just know that, hey, I'm doing it all in one, but optimally, you would have a screen room. And again, this is where we coat and store screens. And we're going to go more into how we coat and the optimal screen storage. It's also where we expose a screen. It's where we're going to expose it using, again, a exposure unit or a computer to screen, laser to screen. Well, actually then expose it there. And then it's also where we develop our screens. Whereas the reclaim area, again, a lot messier. This is typically we're going to remove the ink. You're going to remove the emulsion, and you're going to remove any stains in the actual mesh. So typically two separate rooms, keeping everything nice and clean, right? I mean, it's just like being on press, right, Keith? The cleaner you keep things, the smoother everything goes.
Yeah, when it comes to the screen room, I'll add one thing here, and we may have missed this, but it's very important to have a wet area and a dry area.
Yes.
You want to take the screens, once they're reclaimed, into the screen room dry. I don't want to take wet screens into into the screen room. And I'd like to have the developing of the new screens just outside that dry room. So essentially, in the wet area, you would have those two booths, the reclaim booth and then the developing booth where we rinse out the images of the new jobs going to press. In that screen room, you want to control the temperature and humidity. It only makes sense to do that so that your emulsion is consistent day to day when you go to expose those, because humidity and temperature does affect the emulsion.
Yep, and where I am, I'm in the wet room, and then 10 feet away, I can see my exposure unit, and over there on my screens. When you're in a wet room, you're naturally building up humidity, and you don't want that humidity going into the screen room because it's going to be grabbing to your coated screens and create other problems. So very important to have a humidity reader. Again, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but what is an optimal humidity percentage for the screen room?
Well, there's an industry standard, and that would incorporate whether you're doing CDs, graphics, circuit boards, yard signs, T-shirts, or even glassware. And the target is 76 degrees year-round and less than 40% humidity. And the little gauge that Zach just held up right there, it's called a hydrometer. You can pick those up at your Lowe's, Home Depot, Menards. They're anywhere from $10 to $25. The beauty of that is they're battery operated, but you can walk by that and glance at it and check the temperature and humidity at any time. If you're having troubles on press and you just can't figure it out, you might gaze at that gauge and find out, hey, it's been raining outside for 3 days. The humidity has probably jumped up 20%, and that is the cause and root of the problem.
Again, it's chemistry. Respect it. Don't think you're going to just beat it. Humidity, it's just like anybody who's done digital printing with water-based inks. You want high humidity, whereas when we're screen printing and the screens themselves want low humidity. So uh, again, very important. When it comes to an actual screen, you have two sides. So you have the squeegee side. So the squeegee side is obviously where we're going to have the squeegee uh, print the actual ink versus you have the print side. So the print side is often referred to as the substrate side versus the squeegee side is often referred to the well side. Right, Keith?
Correct.
See, I had my own terminology, and somebody like Keith, who's been doing it for decades, definitely educated me as I was creating this PowerPoint, because I think a lot of the time, Keith, we go to one of these trade shows, we walk by a booth, we see a piece of equipment, that sales rep starts selling us on things, giving us some knowledge, and their goal is to sell something, and they're not always giving you the best education. They're just trying to make that sale. And that's why I highly suggest, again, anytime you attend a trade show, look out for Saati's booth. Have a conversation with them. And Keith, what other resources are there? I know you do a lot of traveling to shops. Is that where you often share a lot of your knowledge? Is actually physically going to a shop?
Well, I'm technically technical sales manager for the chem division of Saati. Saati also has a print division, chem division, a filtration division, a Kevlar and ballistics division. So there's many different things related to Saati, but we as the representatives of Saati go out and our job is to teach and educate them the proper techniques and usage of whatever item they may be purchasing from Saati. And through that, we tend to build the relationships and trust. Then they come back to us for other items to, use in their shop because they know and are rest assured that Saati's not going to misguide them. They're going to give them the best product for their printing solutions in their shop. And as we talked earlier, not every product works in every shop out there. That's why there's a multiple choice in each segment. But Saati prides itself on teaching, training, and educating the industry, whether it be a mom and pop garage shop or the large shops that everybody knows the name of and wish they could have their business. But obviously, the larger you are, the more headaches you can have and more products you use and et cetera, et cetera.
So the logic is educate. That'll make them more successful. Then they'll need to buy more product.
A very dear friend of mine that I worked with for many, many years, I won't mention his name, but anybody that's ever attended a seminar there at his shop will know this. And he always shared that we don't know what we don't know. We tend to thrive and continue on what somebody has told us or what we've learned ourselves. So keep an open mind, listen to someone, try it. If it doesn't work, reach out to that person. Try to figure out what possibly you did wrong, or maybe it's your equipment. But chances are, if that shop has been very successful and they've done this day in and day out, you might have been doing something wrong. And we don't mean any offense, but we just like to try to go in and humbly slow things down and find the root of the problem and create and come up with a solution for that shop.
It's a game of variables and the screen printing world, or really any decoration process. And sometimes you can get results by kind of tweaking the wrong variable. So yeah, it's nice to get that peace of mind and just that extra feedback from somebody like Saati coming into your shop, looking at, hey, you're using this equipment and you may be using the wrong emulsion for these situations. So all right, coating a screen. So screens start off with, well, at least if you've reclaimed them or if you bought a new screen, there's nothing on it. There's no emulsion. How we put emulsion onto a screen is by using what is referred to as a scoop coater, like what you see here. And a scoop coater has a trough where we put all of the emulsion. And you have a sharp edge and you have a round edge. That's why it's called a dual edge coating trough. The sharp edge will lay down less emulsion, whereas the round edge will lay down more emulsion. Um, so it's pretty simple. Keith, is it fair to say one coat of round is almost the same as two coats of the sharp edge? Is that a fair statement?
That's correct. So as an equal equation, if somebody's coating their screens with the sharp edge 2 and 2, meaning they start on the substrate side, 2 strokes slowly, and finish on the well side or print side, 2 strokes, you can achieve that with 1 and 1 round. So for every for every 2 strokes with the sharp edge would be equivalent to 1 stroke with the round edge.
And I mean, okay, makes complete sense. And we're going to talk about this in just a second. Why you would put more emulsion on a screen is typically you're going to want to lay down more ink. You need a higher EOM. So in my shop, we primarily almost always print just screen print transfers. We really aren't printing directly onto a substrate. Because we print transfers, we need to lay down more ink. So whenever we coat, we do typically actually a 1 and 2 with the round edge. So again, that it just depends on the application, obviously, and what you're printing. What is important to remember is the trough, the coater comes in different widths. You want to use a coater that is essentially as close as the size of the screen. So you can see this is a little bit smaller. This would be used for like a 20 by 24 screen versus we would use a larger coating. So we can get that emulsion to get as close to the edge as possible. And you should always be going vertical, right, Keith? You should never be taking, the wrong side and wrong size and going horizontal. Is that correct, or could you get away with it technically?
No, that's not really correct. Honestly, if you get the correct, because the emulsion's liquid, if you get the correct EOM, which stands for emulsion over mesh, if you get the correct thickness of emulsion, it truly doesn't matter which direction you coat. As an example, our dual coating machine that coats 2 screens at the same time, it goes vertically, the length of the screen. If a company had space restraints and they needed a much smaller footprint of a unit, we would put in a single format, a single screen coating machine, and it coats horizontal.
Okay.
And typically, we suggest with automatic coating machines that the coating trough itself is 3 to 5 inches smaller than the inside diameter. I personally like the 3 inches, which gives you 1.5 inches gap between the emulsion and the edge of the frame on each side. And that truly is because of the tension of the mesh. When you have weak tension on the mesh and you're trying to coat that wide, it won't work. If you've got really super high tension screens, yes, you can coat all the way out to the edge like the screen setting behind Zach. But tension wears. And that's the problem with static frames like shown there behind him. As that goes to and from the press 6-8 months a year, it's going to lose tension and not coat as nice as it did when it was new.
That's why you take care of the screens and you properly reclaim them, and you're not just using a power washer to get that emulsion out. You're going to abuse it and again hurt your tension, which obviously is very important when you're on press. So the screen room, where we're coating screens. So again, if you see on the right here, that image is an automatic screen coater. So Keith, what do we have a scoop coater on both sides, and you are actually coating both sides at the exact same time, correct?
That is correct. So if you, as an example, if you were using, and these coating troughs are all the same radius. So they're all medium range, I think 1 to 1.5 millimeter. They're coating both sides at the same time. And the coating machine is programmable to where you could coat the first stroke, both of them at the same time, and then do a single stroke on the squeegee side to create more emulsion on the substrate side. So in this particular case that we're talking about, the stroke would go up, cutting both sides, and then it would drop down, and then only the front carriage would go in. And we call that the push through because it's doing a final stroke on the squeegee side, pushing that emulsion to the back. Then, most importantly, those screens need to dry just like they set in your automatic press. That is mesh down.
And if you're manually coating though, you typically always manually coat the substrate side and then the squeegee side. Is that correct?
Correct. So if you're doing a 1-in-1 or even a 2-in-1, you would coat the back side, the substrate side twice, slowly. Then turn it over and give it one stroke on the squeegee side. There's no reason to coat the screen, flip it over and coat it, and flip it back and coat it. Some of us call that dancing with the screen. It's just because they were improperly taught. Doesn't mean it won't work. It just means it's really not industry standard. And again, just because we say things are standard doesn't mean you're not going to be able to successfully print shirts and make money.
And like you just said, Keith, it's very important that it dries like this. You have
Correct.
the well side facing up, the substrate side facing down, because gravity is naturally going to pull on the emulsion. And this is where we want the emulsion to have our EOM. All right, so manually, again, print side first, squeegee side second, an automatic screen coater. We can do a couple screens at a time. We're doing both the front and the substrate and the well side at the same time. And it'll give us a consistent emulsion thickness. So that's the great thing with automation and something like an automatic screen coater. You're taking a lot of the human error out of it. I mean, if you had two workers and they were coating screens and they were both using the same, edge side, they may get different EOMs just based on the speed that they're coating, how much pressure, and so forth. I mean, is that right, Keith? You could get different scenarios?
It's very true. And in most smaller shops, whether it's all manuals or a couple of manuals and one auto, it's best to have one person coat all the screens because it'll be as consistent as possible to that person's body functions and technique. The exposure settings for each mesh count are set due to the EOM, the emulsion over mesh. So if I coat screens, then Zach coats screens, and we bring a secondary or third person in to coat screens, if we really want to be super technical on this, we could probably find that each person's screens expose a second or two off. Now, again, this is not critical. You're still going to print shirts and make money, but as consistent as you possibly can be, the smoother the production and screens flow out of the screen room. So consistency is the key. Control your variables. So you got a clean screen from the reclaim. Make sure it's properly dry first, then coat it. And it's best to let those coated screens set overnight. So because if you try to rush them, there are consequences.
And just because, again, the emulsion is dry on the screen, maybe you coat it in the morning, a couple hours, it's dry, and you want to get on press. Technically you can, but it would be better if you can let them sit overnight, right?
Correct.
And I definitely learned years ago, never try to coat a screen if it has any wetness, you will not be successful at all. It has to be completely dry. That was when I was a rookie. Okay, so coating screens. Again, we have the substrate and print side. We're going to do both. The well is your squeegee side. More emulsion. So a bigger EOM is going to have a thicker ink deposit. When you want that thicker ink deposit is often with a white underbase, or if you're doing something like 3D puff, or a special effect like glitter, or again, if you're like my shop and primarily printing plastisol transfers, we want a thicker coat. Any input here, Keith? I mean, we kind of already hit this.
No, I think you're spot on. But those white the white underbase, the flash, the 3D puff and glitter, those are going to be much coarser mesh screens than your standard primary color. So you could be looking at anywhere from a 24 mesh on the glitter up to a 60, 86, 110 mesh. Generally, those are going to be 1 and 2 with a round edge. And again, it's going to build up a thicker stencil, which creates a bigger, thicker channel. The channel is the edges of the emulsion. That's the thickness that when you flood the screen and the squeegee drags across and shears, however thick that emulsion is the theoretical ink deposit that's going to be applied to the substrate that you're trying to print. So yeah, that's.
Yep. And well, you brought up a great point there. I'm glad you said that. And we're about to talk about that. But screens come in different mesh counts. And I'll let you explain that more, Keith. But just because you put a lot of emulsion on the screen doesn't mean it's optimal. I mean, like a glitter or a puff, you don't want to be using a 230 mesh screen, even though you got a lot of emulsion on it. It's not.
Try.
Yeah, it's not going to work. So very important, again, one of just many variables to get right to get the best results. Let's talk about emulsion though, before we talk about screens and mesh. So how many different emulsions did you say Saati sells?
You know what? I don't even know anymore. Last I knew and I heard sitting in the lab down there was 80 plus. There's probably more, but again, there are that many different emulsions because there are that many different substrates and segments in the industry, whether it's plastisol or water-based or discharge or conventional inks or UV or thermochromatic. It could be enthone, which is a military spec. There's the reason there's so many different emulsions is because there's so many different applications. Specific applications require specific products for that technique. For textile alone, I probably sell and rotate and recommend maybe 6 or 8 different ones. Another Saati sales rep in Oklahoma or California or Georgia, they also probably sell 6 or 8 on a regular basis. They might be different than mine, but they've been successful, and success in history tends to repeat itself. So we tend to find our comfort zone with those 6 or 8 different emulsions, and that's what we promote. But emulsions are chosen based upon what type of light source you have, number one, what type of inks you're running to try to print, and then the substrate. So those are the 3 most important questions that I'm going to ask a person before I, try to hone in my brain and thinking as to what I'm going to recommend or demo. And sometimes my first choice isn't the right one, but there are always generally 2 or 3 products that are going to fit into any application.
Makes sense. I mean, no, it does, especially with the type of ink, because some inks, they're not always, they're going to break down the emulsion before you're done printing the job. Very important to use the right stuff. And our shop, we're using actually what's shown on the screen, PHU2. Again, we primarily print on to paper for screen print transfers. We have found this to be awesome emulsion. PHU2 commonly used for apparel too, right, Keith?
That is a very unique product that will run water-based, plastisol, or discharge. And I can't say enough about it. It's an awesome product.
Is that common, Keith, that one type of emulsion can be used for traditional plastisol, water-based, and discharge? I thought it wasn't.
It didn't used to be. We've got a very well-renowned chemist that's been around for 40 plus years. He is honestly the knowledge and brains behind all of these. He has forgotten more than I know, and I know a couple things. But these emulsions in the last 8 to 10 years have evolved. There are different components in them that make them both water and solvent resistant. The 2 components are PBOA and PBOH, and they play real well together and bond a very extremely durable stencil to be able to run water-based or discharge. You can run about any emulsion if you're only printing plastisol, because plastisol is pretty forgiving. But when you get into the water-based and the discharge, while you're printing, the ink and squeegee and the friction caused between them are grinding away at the emulsion, trying to delaminate that and help it break down. But if you've properly made your screens and use a good primer like the direct prep and this emulsion, and you nail the initial exposure, then you can post-expose and run water-based and discharge all day long. If something is out of sync, then that's not going to work like we suggest and tell you it's going to. And it kind of goes back to the initial comment that I made in the beginning. The better you set up the screen room and dial in each and every step, the more successful you'll be. But most mom and pop shops or garage shops or something, they're not running water-based and discharge because the environment they're printing in is not adequate. So we're probably a little a little ahead of ourselves with the crowd we've got here, but that's why we do screen making classes 101 and we do an advanced class. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve, and we will customize a program for you if you just reach out and tell us what equipment you have, what you want to print, and we'll dial you in.
With the decades worth of experience. And something about like the PHU2, I don't quote me, but I think it's around 50, 60 bucks. It's a great product for the price. Although I never skimp on consumables. Highly recommend, again, you look at the PHU2, it is a synthesized, meaning there's no extra mixing. And we're going to talk about a dual cure in a second. It's very sensitive to light. And when we say it's sensitive to light, Keith, are we talking about more than just UV light? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, and listen, there's all kinds of different lights that are going to harm the product if it's coated on a screen. To simplify this, it needs to be in a safe light room, which is what we call the screen room. Don't be confused by a dark room, because dark rooms are tray developing film and fixers and stop baths. Those rooms are black. I painted my first screen room black because I didn't know no better. And my Saati rep at the time came in, and this is like 30 plus years ago. He came in and seen my newly painted room, and he laughed at me. And I took offense. But honestly, I didn't know what I didn't know. So the next time I painted it bright white, and I put in yellow safe light sleeves, filtering out 405 nanometers. And then I was able to see and work properly, but the yellow light is a little different to get used to work under, but that's what you want working with pure photopolymers or diazo emulsions, is a safe light.
Typically a yellow light, there should be absolutely no UV light coming into the room. Definitely don't have your screen room with a window that just has the sun just coming straight in. Not good. You need to block out all of that light. You still with us, Keith?
Right here. I am.
Okay. I didn't know if you had the UPS yet or not. Keith's waiting on a UPS delivery that requires signature, and he's been waiting a couple days.
I've been waiting since Tuesday and keep missing them, and I had to pay for an extra delivery. So when the doorbell rings or knocks, I'm gone.
Okay, so you have the pre-synthesized emulsion, but then you can have a dual cure emulsion, which is a two-step, and it involves mixing what is called diazo. And I have a couple different diazos here. I have diazo 1 from Saati and diazo 11. I don't actually use these terribly often. We've played around with them. When you mix diazo, you can hold more details. Well, dual cure can hold the finer detail. So if you were doing a lot of process printing or simulated process printing, or you're working on 300 mesh, that's when you really want to be using the dual cure, right, Keith?
Not necessarily. Again, we can, and the reason Zach just held up two different diazos, the diazo one is standard for a dual cure emulsion. The diazo 11 is a reduced portion that we put in the pure photopolymer, like the PHU2 shown there, and it's just to give it a little bit of resolution punch. It's not always required. And I'll add a couple other things, that the pure photopolymers with no diazo have a 2-year shelf life. So if you have the proper exposure unit and you don't use much emulsion, the pure photopolymer is probably the wiser choice. But you will not be too successful using a pure photopolymer with a fluorescent tube or halogen light source. These pure photopolymers thrive on the higher spectrum of light, which would be metal halide or LED. So that, and again, back to the diazos, that diazo 11 is what we put into pure photopolymers just to give it a little more resolution and detail. And it does make them a little more water resistant as well.
And it changes the exposure time.
Well, it certainly does.
Yeah. So it, again, obviously longer exposure time and a shorter shelf life. We had been doing it in our shop, and then I talked with Keith, and he was like, yeah, you can, but you don't need to be for what I'm printing and the detail and so forth. All I was doing in my shop was shortening the shelf life and spending more money by buying diazo that really wasn't helping me. And that's why, again, it's always a good idea to talk to manufacturers, stop at booths at trade shows, let them know, hey, this is what I'm doing, and you'll get feedback. And just like the PHU2, you said that there was updates in the last 8 to 10 years. Well, I came into the industry like 13 years ago. You got to keep on it. Things change over time. Very important to date the actual emulsion anytime you mix it. Again, that's 6 to 8 weeks. Correct me if I'm wrong, Keith, the older the emulsion gets, the more difficult it is to properly expose it and wash it out. Is that
correct?
Fair?
It's towards the end of its life. It's going to act funny. It's not going to it's going to expose the same, but it's going to be very difficult to wash out. So if you're using a dual cure emulsion because of your light source that you currently own, there's nothing wrong with that. But just understand that you should not coat up 40 or 50 screens if you're only using 4 or 5 a week.
Yeah.
So, and I've owned my own shop a couple times too, and I would just go in and coat on the weekend what thought I would use that whole week. So I might go in and coat 30 screens, 40 screens, because it was a part-time gig. And if I didn't use those within a week or two, I just went and rinsed them out, because the consequences of trying to use a coated screen that had been sitting on the shelf for a week or two with what I was using at the time, it didn't play well. So it's
makes
trial
sense.
by error. You can learn and achieve great things on your own if you're paying attention.
Lots of pulling hair out, Keith. I definitely.
That's why I have none.
Okay, so how to properly mix diazo with emulsion. I wasn't doing this right. I was told one time, just fill it up 3/4 of the way, shake it, let it sit, and so forth. Well, it's a black container. How do you know that you're actually at 75%? It's impossible. So it's smart to actually, use some math. 5 ounces of distilled water, pretty easy to just measure that, put it in there, and you're going to have a consistent amount. If you're not consistent, you're going to water down the emulsion, which is going to lead to a different thickness of the emulsion when you coat it. So very important to properly put the right amount of water. Again, I'm on a well. I don't want to be using well water to be mixing with this. We use distilled water. Once we put the distilled water in here with the diazo, we shake it up really well. We're going to let it sit for a minimum of an hour. Is it a problem if it sits longer than an hour, Keith?
No. And to be honest, and I'll share an exercise I used to do, and I used to mix by the 5-gallon pail. But when I was doing gallons, I would put the amount of water in these bottles, whether it's 5 ounces or 6 ounces, it really doesn't matter. No less than 5, no more than 7. But be consistent with every mix so that your exposure doesn't deviate or differentiate high or low. That's why we want to be precise with how much water goes in there. But you can add the water to 4 of these at a time if you're using a gallon a week, just so that it's shaken up, dissolved, and ready to mix anytime you want to mix.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah. Because what is really in it? It's just a bunch of powder of
Well,
diazo.
there's two different types. There's a powder, and then there's some of them is a syrup, like literally like maple syrup, very thick, and it takes time to dissolve. Um,
Yep.
One thing I will add to this bullet point here is once you put that water in there, shaken up, set overnight, poured it in, mixed it up, cut that bottle open as a good practice and look inside. If you still, if you've already poured it in and mixed it up and think it's proper, you crack it open and find that there's some syrup down in the bottom. Well, guess what? The diazo didn't dissolve properly in the bottle. Therefore, when you did pour it in and mix it up, there's not the same amount in this gallon as there was probably the last gallon. So you've got some potential problems on your hands moving forward.
Yeah. And again, just one of many variables to get right. It doesn't matter if you're properly coating. You're using the same person who coats every screen. But if you didn't mix that diazo the same way as the last batch, you're going to throw some of that off. Are we worried about like water? Because when I think of, I do a lot of DTF printing nowadays. And when we mix ink, it's not optimal to shake it because, sorry, I used the wrong term, bubbles. We don't want to introduce air to it if we're mixing a ink for like direct to film. Is that a problem with this at all? I mean, if we shake it, we're not really worried about
No,
it.
essentially, you're going to shake that bottle and try to get it activated, get it started dissolving. And I used to shake mine 2 or 3 times. I'd walk by them and just shake them. But also, the second part to that bottle is pouring it into the emulsion and mixing those gallons for, I would mix them 5 or 6 minutes. Then that gallon that you poured that diazo into, it needs to set overnight because the bubbles will rise to the top. Then you can scrape them off. Those bubbles, if you try to use that emulsion too soon, are later going to be called pinholes because you didn't mix and let that bucket rest.
So 2 mistakes I was making in my shop. We would shake it. We would let it sit for 10 minutes because my old screen printer once told me, yeah, that's all we need to do. And then after we mixed it, we let it sit for 10 minutes. We poured it in, or we shook it, let it sit for 10 minutes, poured it in, stirred it up, and then I was told let it sit another 10 minutes. So again, you don't know what you don't know, and sometimes you get bad advice. And that's why it's never a bad
And
idea.
again, the guy that taught you those practices work, but there's a lot of agitation and bubbles in that emulsion that could potentially be transferred from the scoop coater to the mesh and then break down on press. So what I'm sharing with you are foolproof scenarios to mix that bottle, let it rest, mix the emulsion, let it rest. Then when you go to use it, it should be uniform throughout the bucket with no bubbles, no debris, no contaminants. Take off, go.
And sometimes I was thinking, well, we improperly reclaimed it, or we still have, chemical in the screen. We didn't get it properly degreased. And I think the problem was there when it really was the emulsion itself. So many variables to get right. Screen room. So typically we have a drying cabinet, like what we see here on the right. And that's typically going to be throwing air and a fan to circulate it. Very important to be circulating. And like he said earlier, substrate side down. So we would typically, again, needs to be like this. So gravity pulls the emulsion to the substrate side. So gravity pulls it down. Heat will speed up the drying process, Keith, if you don't have a screen drying cabinet, is it technically just letting it air dry? Are there problems with that? It just takes
No,
longer?
here's the biggest problem I see in smaller shops as they go into. They coat the screens. They're in a open air rack inside the screen room. They're throwing a bunch of fans on them to try to dry them quick because they got a job they need to run. The worst possible item you could put in your screen room is a fan because no one cleans the room properly. You're blowing dirt and dust
Yep.
on a high-end commodity screen that you just spent all this time to do it perfectly. Now you're blowing dirt all over it. So if you've got a dehumidifier in the room, trying to control the temp and humidity that we talked about in the beginning of this broadcast, that dehumidifier will dry those screens properly because it'll pull the moisture out of the screen. Understand that generally it's about 60 to 65% of the emulsion in your bucket is water. So as those screens are drying, the water is evaporating out. So a dehumidifier will pull that moisture out of the emulsion into the container. You pour it out later. If you put a fan on them, it's going to dry the surface, trap the moisture, and it's going to take 8 times longer to dry. The best common practice for coating and drying screens is to coat them before you leave the shop for the day. So that honestly, they've got about 14 to 16 hours to properly dry in the open air with no fans, a dehumidifier. You come in tomorrow morning, those screens will be perfectly ready for you to use.
Okay. No, it makes so much sense. And it is funny. We talked about this just briefly before we started, Keith. I can't tell you how many YouTube videos I see somebody and they've got box fans and they're like, put it here and just turn the box fan on. And you're like you said, it's just blowing who knows what right onto that emulsion and getting it dirty. And in my screen room, I have plastic covering the whole rack. I mean, I really, unless I'm drying and I have it open, but yeah, dirt and debris will, I mean, you just don't want it anywhere. So if you are using a cabinet though, you want to have it around 90 degrees with air circulation. It'll often take 1 to 2 hours with the screen dryer. It's going to heavily be based on, your mesh count and your EOM. If you do a 1 and 2 on the round versus a 1 and 1 on the sharp edge, it's going to have a different dry time. Can you explain a little bit about how the mesh count influences the amount of dry time, Keith?
Well, I mean, you just hit on it. A 230 mesh is going to hold a very thin layer of emulsion, and it may be 12 to 15% EOM, and that's a percentage of emulsion over the thickness of the thread itself. So it's a thin thread. A 110 mesh is going to be a much thicker thread and hold a lot more emulsion. So it's pretty generic. The thinner the mesh, the quicker and easier it's going to dry. The lower the mesh count, the more emulsion it's going to hold and the much longer time for it to properly dry.
And if you
Make
let
sense?
if you let it sit overnight, you're good no matter what.
That's why there are some idiosyncrasies that we can put in place that, hey, listen, if you reclaimed a bunch of screens, don't put fans on those out in the reclaim area. Just let them sit overnight. And then sometime tomorrow, coat those screens. And if you have the perfect real world is if you expose 20 screens a day, you have to reclaim 20 screens a day and coat 20 screens a day. You don't want to reclaim and coat the same day. So find out whatever equation your shop is. It's kind of like the circle of life I go with all the time. Let's say the magic number is 10 for some of the smaller shop audits. To run the shop properly, you'd probably need 50 screens. That's 10 in the reclaim, 10 in the screen room that they reclaimed yesterday, then 10 that you coated yesterday. Mm-hmm. So reclaim's got 10, the screen room's got 20. That's 10 screens uncoated and 10 screens coated from the day before and current day. Then production's going to have twice the amount. So 10 in the reclaim, 10 waiting to coated, 10 coated, 20 in the production. That if you did 10 screens every day and moved them from each segment, you'll never be hurting for screens. you'll always be prepared for a rush job, and life will be much easier.
And these drying cabinets typically hold 10. That's what I have in my shop. That's why I do batches of 10, because it's very easy.
And those drying cabinets tend to spoil some people because they know you can reclaim them, throw them in there, and go to lunch, come back and coat them, throw them back in there. But if you notice, you're chasing your tail. You're trying to reclaim and dry and then coat and dry so you can shoot that job today. It's a little counterproductive, but if you have to do it, you have to do it. And at least you've got the equipment to make that happen. But if you truly set up your shop properly in those segments that I just talked about, there's some equipment that won't be necessary. But if you're not prepared,
right, screens and the types, very important too, Keith, right? I mean, if you don't have you're in trouble.
That magic number of screens is not expressed or talked about enough in some shops. I work with some shops that do 400 or 500 screens a day. Well, they've got 2,500 screens in their shop so that they can properly manage 400 to 500 a day.
That's not my shop. That's a big shop.
Oh, there are bigger, but they have bigger problems too.
And like you kind of just said there, Keith, sometimes certain pieces of equipment can make employees lazy. We're going to talk about that here in just a little bit with a dip tank. But yeah. Okay, so storing the screens, we've talked about this. So this is your typical screen rack. In my shop, we just made one. We took 2x4s, made a frame, and then made it so that we could create our own shelf. These aren't always the cheapest thing. I was just kind of wanting to build it myself, but very important to properly store the screens. The biggest thing is humidity. You have to respect the chemistry. You don't want humidity in the screen. Keith, you said 40%, less than 40%, 76 degrees. Keith, are you in Troy, Ohio? Is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I'm in Columbus, Ohio. So we're actually in the same state. Keith can relate to the weather. It gets cold here. And in the winter, the humidity is much lower, especially having that furnace on all the time. So it's not as much of an issue versus in the summer. I mean, I always have a humidifier always running at all times in the screen room to keep the humidity 40% or less. Very important to have a controllable temperature. How can having a lower temperature or a higher temperature than 76 degrees affect things, Keith? Is it just trap water? The humidity?
Well, it's just, I don't know of anything that works really, really well when it's super cold. We don't work very well when it's super cold.
No, you're right.
But we've just found that this is the sweet spot, that everything works very well together. It's consistent, it's repeatable, and there's confidence in the numbers, confidence in the temperature and humidity. You can make a screen room too dry. It is possible, especially if you're running a certain type of CTS unit, which is a little counterproductive, but they want the humidity in there to make the machine run better and more consistent. However, more humidity in the screen room is not necessarily good for the stored screens because they will absorb moisture just sitting in the rack.
Yep.
Therefore, they don't necessarily expose and develop as well. And then when they get out to the press, there is room for potential problem. I'm not saying there's going to be. It's just we want to control. And I mentioned it before. Controlling the screen room variables is the key to having a smooth transition of your screens in and out of the room back on the press.
And you're going to extend the shelf life, I would imagine. Your pre-synthesized, you have 6 to 8 weeks versus a dual cure, you have 2 to 3 weeks. And if your temperature and humidity are fluctuating and you're not controlling it properly, these expiration timeframes could be thrown off. Right, Keith?
Correct. And again, these are comfortable numbers, but your shop may have different temps and humidities and so forth. And you might have a slightly different result, but it's pretty tried and true that you don't want to coat too many ahead of time. Just because you're slow now doesn't mean you should coat up and store every screen you have in the shop. because
Did it?
again, if they're left set too long, 4 or 5 weeks, I've seen people have them set 2 months and still rinse out okay. But, they've got the control.
And again, it depends on your design and things. I mean, if all you're doing is a square, may not be that hard. But if you're doing a lot of detail, maybe not when you're washing it out. So Mother Nature. Okay, so let's talk about making a screen. So what you see right here is your classic inkjet printer, and it is printing what is called a film positive. I thought I had my film in here, but I don't. My shop is small. Screen printing is not my bread and butter. I know enough to be dangerous. So we're the classic. We're going to print onto clear transparent film, and we're going to then tape that to a screen and expose it. So print the film. It's very opaque black ink on the transparent film. We will then expose it using exposure unit with a vacuum to hold everything down in place. It's very important that light doesn't get in around the film. That's why the vacuum really helps. And that's how we develop our screens. The newer technology, computer to screen. When did computer to screen kind of come about, Keith?
I'm going to say 15 years ago, maybe
Okay,
longer,
so
maybe 20. But that was for very selected higher end shops that, and I know inkjet hit the market first, followed by wax. Yeah, I'd say they've been out at least 16, 18 years.
okay, and how a computer to screen works, it is essentially completely eliminating the film portion, because this machine, the screen will go in there and it'll essentially print the positive directly onto the screen. I mean, am I using the correct terminology here?
That is spot on. Instead of printing on the transparency, you're printing on the emulsion, and all and those that's the print engine and capping station and everything in that machine is typically used in that desktop printer. They've just pulled the guts and mounted it in this and come up with a real cool, innovative, patented design, and they're printing directly on the emulsion. Which this is stuff that I dreamt about back in the late 80s and 90s when I was in production. We always thought there'd be a way somehow. So this hit the market and made a lot of people smile because, and again, we talked and dreamt about this 30 years ago.
And well, and like you said, when they first came out, they weren't cheap, and they're still not cheap. But it for a larger shop, it's often a key. It'll allow you to hold better detail and resolution. But you're still using an exposure unit. You're printing directly onto the screen, but then you have to take that screen and still put it in an exposure unit and expose it with light. So you're still developing it somewhat the same way, versus the newest technology, which I haven't seen many other manufacturers come out with this. I mean, I think Saati is a leader. You could tell me, Keith, is laser to screen.
Saati was,
yes,
in North America. Saati was the first to release this, and our program is 5 years old this year. 350, 400 machines in the market. This
Wow.
is an exposure unit, so don't be misled or misunderstand the process. Your artwork goes to this machine through the rip, and it exposes in a negative format. So we're exposing the outer edges of the design you're going to print through, as where what you were used to was making a film positive on the screen, and the exposure hardened everything on that screen except for was under the ink or transparency. This particular machine goes across with lasers and exposes the background. When it's done and you go to develop it, everything that the lasers did not expose will develop and rinse out. I'm sorry, yeah, it will rinse out. So, and this does everything from a 420 mesh down to a 17. And the different types of emulsion on this could vary. We've got 2 or 3 that really thrive well on these machines. And this is a 25 by 36 screens here. Those will probably take about 3.5 to 4 minutes to completely image. The beautiful thing about this is it's impossible to crash a head on the edge of the frame like the inkjet and the wax jet do often. You crash a head on the wax jet, it could be $5,000 to $8,000. The same with the inkjet. And carelessness sometimes is the result of crashing that head. With this laser, there's no consumables. There's anywhere from 96 to 128 lasers on the textile machines, and they're good for 10,000 hours at 100% power. We don't run them at 100 power, so we found the individual lasers anywhere to last anywhere between, even some of the earliest machines I sold 5 years ago, we've not yet replaced the laser in those machines.
Wow. And I've talked to other manufacturers who sell computer to screen equipment, and they're very high on the laser to screen. They'll tell you, yeah, we weren't thinking ahead, because this is the future, right, Keith? I mean, it's groundbreaking for developing.
It's a pretty awesome piece of equipment.
And you're exposing it, you have no consumables. And the reason why you can't crash a head is because there's a lot of distance between the laser and the screen itself, right?
About 2¼ inches.
Okay. Very user friendly. If you wonder, like, it's kind of showing how it would be exposed, but there is essentially big door that comes down so that UV light isn't hitting anybody.
Yeah, and anyone can go on YouTube and look at the different options we have. We have a single screen machine that will do like 5 little tag screens or rapid tag screens, or a 25 or 36. And then there are other machines like this one that'll do 2 2331s, 2 25 by 36s, or I've got a new machine going out that's doing a 40 by 50 all over print screen. And then there's obviously bigger machines that go into the graphics market to do a Sakurai screen, which is like a 49 by 61 for transfers.
We actually, if anybody wants some more information on this too, we at DecoNetwork at a previous Long Beach show made a pretty cool video on it. We couldn't see it actually totally being demoed off the floor, but it was the detail that you can hold with this that was incredible. And anytime you have a film positive, you're just, it can be harder to hold detail versus using a computer to screen, or again, a laser to screen. Just the detail is incredible as far as being able to develop it. Okay, so variables that can affect the exposure time, Keith, the actual unit itself. And so each type of brand is going to work a little bit different. The type of bulb, or using LED or not. The distance. What did we mean by the distance? I can't remember, Keith.
Well, let's go back to the exposure unit. You've got fluorescent tube exposure units that are old as the New Testament. They still work, but they thrive on a diazo type of emulsion. The next type would be a halogen bulb, and a lot of people, buy and build their own from a halogen lamp. Those also thrive on a diazo type emulsion because those two types of bulbs don't have a very high spectrum of light. And then there's something called a metal halide that gets into the bigger, more expensive units than the LED. All those are relative to the distance. We like the distance from the glass to the bulb. A lot of people say it's corner to corner. Your screen, say like a 2331, it's not really corner to corner of the screen, it's corner to corner of the emulsion. So I can do a single screen at about 22 inches. You always want the outer perimeter of the light to be bigger than the screen itself.
Okay.
So that everything gets the same amount of attention and spectrum of light. So you can play with that, but shooting them too close with the wrong setup, again, there's consequences.
And again, why it really helps having somebody like yourself come in there and look at, hey, with this exposure unit, we may want to change some of this. Um, Obviously, the emulsion itself is going to influence the exposure time. The type, again, is it a dual cure or not? The amount of coats, you do a 1 and 1 versus a 1 and 2, it's going to expose differently. Um, Also, the screen mesh itself, like Keith mentioned earlier, different meshes will hold different amounts of emulsion. A 1 and 1 on an 86 versus a 1 and 1 on a 305 mesh is technically going to have a different EOM and it's going to have a different exposure time. But how does tension affect the exposure time? I would have never thought this would be a variable that affects it, Keith.
Well, when the tension is woven properly, the mesh is opened up proper like this, so the emulsion is going to flow through there and bond and expose well. Lack of tension, it tends to close in because the mesh is weak. And I don't know that it's necessarily going to affect the exposure much, but you're not going to get as much ink flow. So
Okay.
as an example, a 110 mesh at 26, 28 newtons, it's going to print, or it's going to flood and print beautifully. If you try that same 110 mesh, same design on 18 newtons, you're not going to get as much ink down. It's probably going to moray a little bit, and you're going to struggle to get good opacity. Every mesh count related to exposure times technically has a different time. One of my biggest pet peeves walking in or doing consulting with an account is that they shoot the 110, the 160, the 230, and the 305. They shoot them all at 14 seconds. And and I asked just recently, I asked Brad, I was like, hey, who come up with that? He's like, I don't know. Lisa did it before me, and Tom taught her, and I think it was Randy before Tom that taught him. We all just did what the previous guy did. So from 10 years ago, the first guy that was shooting at 14 seconds, it's carried for 9 years, everyone shooting at 14 seconds. And they're like, who cares? They still printed the jobs, and they got sent out, got billed, got paid for. Who cares? Well, when you go over and watch the reclaim struggle to reclaim those underexposed screens, then they finally get it.
Yep.
So that's one of the things I shared with you earlier, that the better you set up the shop with the frame, the tension, the thickness of emulsion you want, and the exposure, it makes the reclaim and the press run so much smoother. I can't even put a number on it. It's
And very
tried and true.
important, good to have an actual tension meter in the shop, and optimally two. That way you can have one calibrated at the same time that you still have one. What we learned with having a tension meter is we would get some new screens, and not all screen resellers are stretching them correctly. They think, oh, well, it's on there, we're good. Keith, different mesh counts have different tension, correct?
That's correct. And ideally, if 110 might have a super thick thread, and the 230 might have a super thin thread. Those hold different emulsion thicknesses. That's why we have different exposure times. However, if you're not checking the tension on the screens that you're buying from Acme Screen Stretching Supply, and you go to start coating and using them, you're just trusting that they did it correctly. I always suggest call them out, have your own tension meter. When they land on the dock, pull them out of the box and check them. Whatever's not at the proper spec, send them back. Because of the different thread diameters, the lower mesh counts will hold a higher tension. And then the higher mesh counts will hold a lower tension. Now, there's a whole different conversation that needs to be had when sending a 6-color or 8-color job to the press. Those tensions should all be pretty close together to spec. Because if you send a bunch of screens out there at 28 and 30 newtons and you try to slip one in at 18, chances are that 18 Newton screen is not going to register to the other 26, 28 Newton screen.
Very important. Yeah, yeah.
I learned that the hard way back in my day, not knowing this. I would just go in the screen room and reshoot it, reshoot the screen that wouldn't register, and typically it would go on the press and register just fine. I had no idea what the problem was. I later in life found out that the variance in proper tensions in my screen room were all over the place. And when I started to fix that, I never had that problem again.
And what we learned was don't trust everybody you buy a screen from. I mean, it, and again, a different conversation to have is you brought up like Sakurai and their types of screen or anything that could be retensioned, like a Newman roller frame, and it's so easy for you to adjust the tension whenever, but tension is so important, and yeah. The color of the mesh, though, Keith. So most mesh is going to be a white color if it's under 160. And then right around 160, and again, this is from what I know, right around 160, you can get it in white or yellow. And then you get in 200, 300, it's going to be yellow mesh.
Well, a lesson to be taught here. All mesh is woven white. All mesh. We dye the mesh yellow. We used to dye it orange, red, black. We dye the mesh according to what specs and what the market is asking for. Typically, 125 or 140 and less would be white mesh. 140 and higher would be yellow mesh because you're trying to hold better detail on those higher mesh counts. The reason the mesh is dyed yellow is so that it slows down the exposure to hold the finer detail. That's why the mesh is colored yellow. Now, with the advancement in technology and these laser machines and CST and Lucier and Syntronic and so forth, in the higher graphics market where their lowest count is 380, 420, 460, 502, all of their mesh count, because of the new technology, is white. So what we thought we had a handle on 15 years ago isn't necessarily true today. Because those higher end graphics guys that spend $2 million on a machine to image a screen 72 by 144, they have to have the white mesh. Otherwise, they'll be there for hours waiting on the screen to expose.
That makes sense.
That's a little deep for this.
Yeah,
for this platform.
I mean, I've been on sites where they'll have, again, like a 160 and you get it white or yellow. And it's just important to remember they're going to expose at different times.
It's very important. If you're going to have, and I run into this just last week, the guy had 160 white and 160 yellow. I'm like, why? He's like, I don't know. It's just what the it's just what the restretcher sent me. I said, well, you need to call him, tell him you want everything yellow, and either cut these. And initially, it's because they are two completely different exposures, and the 160 high definition detail that you can hold on the yellow mesh, you cannot hold on the white mesh.
Yep.
So now when you go in the screen room to pick that choice of mesh, you got to flip through it and find the two yellow ones you had because the 8 white ones won't work. So again, control the screen room variables.
Speaking of variables, if you underexpose, so you don't expose it for enough time, it is going to create problems in different ways. So it's gonna be vulnerable to pinholes and premature breakdown. It's also going to be more difficult to remove the emulsion when you're in the reclaim room. Whereas if you overexpose, you're exposing it for too much time. And that's going to potentially lead to loss of detail because it's more difficult to wash out. And how we combat that is by using an exposure, oh gosh,
Calculator.
I mean, this is the exposure calculator. Saati has the 21-step sensitivity guide. And I have one, it's just like 10 feet away, wanted to hold it up. Looks like this little strip here, and there's 21 steps. And Keith, yeah, you want to explain to me how this exactly works and why you want that step?
This is super simple to use. And for you guys, it's got an exposure unit with glass. You can put this on the glass, the dull side facing up, and tape it directly on the glass. So when you want to check the exposure of your screens, you just bring the screen over the strip, pull it down, draw a vacuum, expose that screen however long you think is correct. Then as you wash out the image, both sides, this is going to rinse out from 21 all the way down, and you want it to stop at 7. There's a couple great YouTube videos on this 21-step sensitivity guide that you can watch. But if it holds 8 or 9, that's overexposed. If it holds 5 or 6, that's underexposed. So the sweet spot is a solid 7. What we mean by a solid 7 is all 4 corners of that square on the 7 stays in the screen. Because in a sense, this is a Stouffer scale. Every one of these are filtered to a different degree. And we find that 7 is the sweet spot for the stencil to be properly hardened, where it's not underexposed, it's not overexposed. It should be able to go to and from the press and not have any problems.
And you really want to dial in each mesh count with each emulsion coating, strategy with each type of emulsion. And if you keep changing any of those variables, you're changing the exposure time. You need to recalculate the correct amount of time.
Yeah, a lot of people don't understand that. If you change the mesh count or change the coating technique, you need to double check the exposure because it will be slightly different.
And what I didn't realize until we talked, Keith, was that underexposure. I often can get results. I can get that screen burned and it'll print, but later on when I go to reclaim it, it's more difficult than it should be because I underexposed.
Yeah, I like to set people up and I'll ask them, does your reclaim pretty smooth? Oh yeah. Cool. How does your emulsion come out? And they're like, why? I said, well, does it come out gummy or chunky or stringy? Oh yeah, all the time, but that's normal. We're used to it. Well, unfortunately, that's not normal. And they're just used to it because they've been doing things wrong for a considerable amount of time. So the idea is if you can expose the screens and emulsion properly, it will, just by default, speed up the reclaim. That emulsion should properly dissolve out of there. I have reclaimed screens and taken out the emulsion with a garden hose to prove to people that it can be done. But again, you've got to control the variables, get the proper emulsion thickness on each mesh count, dial in each mesh count with the exposure, and then if you have the proper emulsion and your inks aren't locking up that emulsion, it should reclaim just fine.
Coating screens, developing screens are fun compared to reclaiming screens. So if you can make that reclaim easier just by properly exposing, highly suggest it because nothing is the least favorite thing to do with screen printing has to be reclaim. I mean, has to be. Now, when it comes to reclaiming screens, you have a few different chemicals. So first you have an ink remover. So I have a nice dirty screen here that I didn't prep at all. It's got a bunch of ink on it. So what we'll do is we will take a spray bottle and we will spray the ink, and we will then use a scrub brush to scrub everything, and it helps break down the ink. Sound right, Keith? That's what
yes, it does. So
okay.
the proper ink remover will break down the pigments, bonding agents, plasticizers, and adhesives and allow them to be flushed to the drain legally. Now, if you're on a septic system, you do need to check and make sure you've got a 300 or a 3-day retention pond, basically. So if you use 100 gallon of water, that tank should be a 300 gallon tank. Make sense?
Yep.
So ink removers are designed to destroy the plastisol to where it will never come back and be able to bond as one again. And through the proper ink remover and water and a brush, you can officially do this with a garden hose.
And that's what we do. Yep. Then we have emulsion remover, often abbreviated ER. So and again, these are actually some of the chemicals we use in our shop. Our ink remover that we like to use is the IR26, and then the emulsion remover ER2. And it's concentrated, or at least this one is, where it is very potent. Um, if I were to spray it with the spray bottle, Keith, how much would I cut emulsion remover like this ER2? How much water would I have to the actual emulsion remover?
You should, especially in the smaller shops, you can buy this in a quart, and you can make a gallon of product ready to use with 5 ounces of material. So with this exercise, I would take a gallon jug and I would fill it 3/4 the way with water. I would add 5 ounces to that container and then top it off with water. It will easily mix itself.
Okay.
That's roughly 35 to 1.
35 to 1. Okay. You can also use ER, like this ER2, in a dip tank, correct? I mean, there's dip tank emulsion removers, but technically you could use this as well in a dip tank?
You can, and I would use approximately 10 ounces in a 40-gallon tank.
Okay.
But understand that the emulsion that you use and the thickness in the OM all determines the strength and activity level we want in a dip tank. But for you dip tank users, please change the terminology and use that dip tank as an applicator. You're putting the emulsion on there, so let it sit for a minute and pull it up out of there and let all the residual chemical run back into the tank. If you've left that screen in the tank too long and the emulsion has fallen off, you have just set yourself up for failure. Because number one, it's not being used the way it was intended, because the emulsion that fell out of the screen is laying in the bottom, and the chemical that's in there thinks there's screen. So it's constantly eating at that product. And what happens, and essentially your chemistry will die 10 times quicker, and you'll have to add more product to it. So that's why I say dip tanks can be used very efficiently if you use it as an application tool, not a soak tank. So I kind of despise the word dip tank because nobody just dips it. They soak them.
They soak them.
Oh.
And yeah. And like I said, don't let it sit in there. But we haven't sprayed emulsion remover on a screen since I got the dip tank. But when we pull it out, like you said, it's just applying it. It's getting that layer on there, and then you should be able to wash it out. Mesh prep. So direct mesh prep. This is a degreaser, correct?
It falls in the degreaser category, but this is direct prep 2. It is patented. It acts like a primer to the mesh, so that in essence, like you paint a car, you're going to paint something. You always primer it. Why do you primer it? Because you want the paint to stick and bond better. When you use the mesh prep on mesh, it allows the emulsion to coat and then bond. It's going to create a stronger bond so that longer runs and or water basin discharge hold up longer during the process instead of breaking down. This is one of the best products, and there again, there's YouTube videos out there on each one of these products, but this product probably is one of the most impressive demos because people don't degrease their screens because they don't see the benefit. If you do a half a screen with this, and this is put on, allowed to dwell with a soft brush and low pressure rinse. We don't pressure wash this product, but that mesh will look like a sheet of glass after you rinse this off. And comparing it to the other side of the screen, it'll be splotchy and sporadic.
This goes back, you can coat properly, you can expose properly, but if you didn't have a good surface to work with from the start, Keith, you're not going to get the most optimal results.
Yeah, let's face it, reclaim is generally where we start all the new employees. It's referred to as referred to as the dungeon, the basement, the hellhole, all kinds of crap, but it's the most important job in the shop. Because whatever gets sent into the screen room from the reclaim area has to be coated. They're on a timeline, and if they coat the screens and they get fish eyes and pinholes, and the emulsion won't stick to it, you got to start all over.
Good idea to use this direct prep for new screens that you get, right? Don't just pull them out and
Absolutely.
coat them. I mean, they could have oils and dirt and
If
so
you
forth.
really wanted to, make your life easier, I would use this each and every time after reclaim.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
again, it's put on, allowed 1 minute to dwell, and then it's low pressure rinsed and put in a rack with no fans.
And when you put it in a rack, does it matter which side is facing up or down? Is it
It
like,
doesn't, but just for error of ripping screens, in the reclaim area, I made it a practice a long time ago to put mesh up. Because the reclaim guys, they don't necessarily aren't trained or have the knowledge of the actual screen maker themselves, and they could be a little aggressive or a little rough with the screens. So I just tell those guys, you're mesh up, the guy inside's mesh down.
okay.
So if you ever want the mesh downside job, you ever want that job, do this correctly, and I'll move you up later.
Yeah, it is funny how you say that. Most of the new employees, they start in the least liked area, but it is so important. Um, Now, sometimes when you clean, you've removed the ink, you've removed the emulsion, but you still see a little bit of a stain in the screen, often referred to as a haze. Um, so we have here what's referred to as HR6 haze remover. What I really liked about the HR6 is it does not come off as if it is going to kill me. I've had some chemicals before I started using Saati, and if you opened the haze remover container, it just seemed like you were killing your brain cells. It was so powerful. Um, but yeah, a haze remover will help remove that stain. And let's just leave it at that, Keith, and keep going on. But you should not be using a haze remover very often, right? I mean, it's only if you have a stain in the screen.
Generally, the terminology haze or ghost image is caused by whatever they used at the press. Screen opener is one of the biggest contributors to a ghost image. And unfortunately, none of the 4 products shown on here will take out a stain in the mesh if it's been set up by a flammable chemical. So if you use flammable chemicals at the press, then generally you've got to use that nasty caustic product that Zach just talked about to get that stain out. So essentially, if you use the hot stuff on the press floor, you've got to have something hotter than that to remove it in the reclaim. But if your chemistry and somebody's come in and set you up right and you have the proper press wash, there shouldn't be any stain that we can't handle with these 4 products.
It's funny like how the screen room and the press room can continuously feed each other, battles of, you probably wouldn't need to use that screen opener if it was properly cleaned to begin with. And then they have to use the screen opener to be able to print with it. And then it becomes more difficult to reclaim. So removing ink from a screen, again, we use IR26. We try to first scrape out all the ink that we can using an ink card. And then we apply the ink remover, which will degrade the ink to make it drain safely. So again, we use a spatula, spray it on both sides, scrub it, and then just spray it with a garden hose to get it to wash out and go down the drain. Also, something you taught me, Keith, was you want to rinse from the bottom up. And actually, you actually do recommend, we do need to use a pressure washer with this, or does it really matter?
It depends. You can use a pressure washer for all steps except for the direct prep.
Direct prep. Okay.
And if you use a pressure washer on this step, you will have less pigment left behind to address at the end.
Okay. And
but
why
bottom up, the
Yeah.
bottom up is so that everything is consistent. we're not washing a car, even though we're guys and we're particular about that. But if you got a very large image area, let's say it's 14 by 16, and it's fire engine red or navy or hunter green. If you start rinsing from the top down, the excess water is going to rinse off the chemistry. The stain and pigment's going to lock back up to the mesh. If you start from the bottom and work your way up, every time the pressure washer passes, moves up, and comes across, it's going to be consistent. You're going to get exactly the same amount of cleanliness on the entire image versus starting at the top and working your way down. I was taught this in the late 80s, but if you don't believe me, try it on that real stubborn ink. You'll notice right away how problematic it is. And therefore, once you get the emulsion out, you've got this dominant, nasty stain in the screen that you could have taken out more of had you gone bottom up.
Good tip. I don't think we were ever doing that. All right, so emulsion remover. So it's going to break down the emulsion. Again, if you're using a concentrated emulsion remover, you want to mix it to whatever it says. Often with this, like Keith said, 35-1 with water. Spray it on both sides of the screen so it can break down, and use an abrasive brush. And then let it sit for a minute. If you just throw that on there and just start pressure washing it, you've not let the chemistry do its job. It needs to dwell for a minute. And also real important, Keith, correct me if I'm wrong, you don't want this drying ever in a screen because it'll lock up that emulsion and eventually become impossible to remove.
Well, if any of you guys watching this ever spray a screen down with a emulsion remover, get called to the phone, or went to break or lunch, or just went home for the night, and when you came back, you realized just how difficult it was, you'll never do that again.
You'll never do it again.
You'll never do it again. But you got to acknowledge that you made an error. This emulsion remover, actually any emulsion remover, when it starts to break down the emulsion, there's a little sweet spot or a timeline that you got, dwell time, to get that out. Because it's broken down the emulsion. As it starts to oxidize and get air to it, it will lock itself back up. Once it's locked back up, you couldn't put a 55-gallon drum of emulsion remover on that one screen and have it dissolve again. It is, the components and everything have changed. It is a different animal now. And as a wise old sales guy, he's no longer with us, but he told me, if you do that too often, don't fight it. You need the savior to come and take care of that screen is a numbers 13 Stanley razor knife. Just cut it out and move on.
Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. And it is funny, Keith, you do it once and you battle it, you don't make that mistake again. Yeah, you're not getting it out. All right, so let's talk about the dip tank, which Keith and I have talked about. This can make an employee lazy if you don't monitor them. Personally, I love using the dip tank in ours, primarily because, again, we use a lot. We have a thick EOM when we're doing transfer. So it's more emulsion to remove. Letting it sit in there for just a couple of minutes just applicates both sides of the screen well with the emulsion remover. And again, you take it out, you hit it with the power washer, and it should just dissolve. But yeah, Keith, any other input here about the dip tank? I know it's not your favorite tool.
Well, and anybody that knows me in the industry knows I'm not a big fan. And it's because they tend to make employees lazy. For those getting paid by the hour, they're trying to make their job a little easier, they'll load this rascal up and go to break or go to lunch or come back tomorrow. And it's still going to be wet and easy to work, but all the emulsion is falling out to the bottom. Once that emulsion is laying in the bottom, that's industrial waste now. You just can't legally throw that in the dumpster wet. You gotta go through some other steps. So if you have a good work crew and you can teach them the benefit of this, it can be a great resource for your reclaim area. But the key word is use it as an application tool. Dip it in a minute, pull it out, and let it rest. Let all the chemical run off of that back into the tank. Even though this is a concentrate used in there and it's 90% water, it's got to be monitored. You want it to be consistent. If you use this correctly, you'll probably come in and add maybe a quart every couple of weeks or less than that. You know, the ER2 is pretty strong for a dip tank. That's why I mix it really, really weak, like 10 ounces to 40 gallon. Or this ER6 is more forgiving. It's a 10 to 1. So they're cheaper, less expensive to purchase, but the ER6 is a 10 to 1. So that 40 gallon tank would take 4 gallon. Competitors' products, and I won't mention their name, they're at a 5 to 1 ratio. So you would add 8 gallon to that tank to do the same thing as we would do with 4.
Important not to put ink remover in that dip tank as well, right, Keith? Because you're going to literally kill the emulsion remover.
Yeah, I mean, there's some data out there that supports that, but I've just never been successful with it. If you start mixing emulsion remover and ink remover, just remember one will always outpower the other, and you know it's going to kill that emulsion remover that's in there. So will it take off the ink? Maybe, but you don't soak your screens in an ink remover vat and pick it up and expect it to be completely dissolved.
No.
You're just creating yourself bigger problems by that industrial waste, and then you gotta haul that off. Call your safety clean guy to come and pick up a drum.
Yeah, I'm sure we all do that properly, Keith. Again, sometimes you need to address a stain, which is often referred to as a ghost image, sometimes referred to as a haze. It's caused by, you know, a long run print or using flammable chemicals at the press, like a screen opener. Just, yeah, not fun. Yeah, I really like the HR6. It's not as, you know, powerful and dangerous, but I mean, stains are going to happen, right, Keith? At some point, you need to have a
Yeah,
hazer.
and typically our industry's changed a little bit. When I've got a ghost image in the screen, I generally will come back in today's with the technology changing. I'll come back with the same ink remover that I used initially,
Yep.
and I'll spray it down and hit it with a clean brush and take out that stain. And then I use the direct prep.
Then you use
But
direct. Yep.
this HR6 is a stain remover and degreaser in one, and it is thick and viscous like Cool Whip, but it's got a slight granule in there that kind of aggravates the surface of the mesh to help pull that pigment up when you blow it off. So this would be put on with a dollop, like Cool Whip on pumpkin pie, but put a dollop on the screen. You work it in with a wet brush, let it sit 5 or 10 minutes. It won't hurt the mesh. It won't hurt the glue. It's safe for you to handle. After it's sat for 5 or 6 minutes, pressure wash both sides and low pressure rinse with the garden hose. It is a beautiful product. It smells like bubble gum, cherries.
Yep. And again, we've used it. Keith, you kind of brought something up. Hopefully you agree with me. This is, and we are going through brushes. You don't just keep a brush, but this is a brush that looks what it looks like when we're removing ink from a screen to start. And then we have a totally different brush for when we're removing that haze. I wouldn't want to hit it again with this same brush. I might be using IR26 again, but I'm not trying to introduce more ink back into the screen. So it's important to be using a cleaner brush when you're doing that second time. Okay, so again, the direct prep, we'll spray it on both sides of a wet or a dry screen, scrub it with a non-abrasive brush, and then rinse the screen with a strong water spray to remove the chemical. Although you said, Keith, don't power wash it. You want it to just be with the garden hose, and then properly dry it. In a dust-free environment, don't be putting a fan right in front of it and throwing dirt on what you just cleaned. Now, if I was a bigger shop, and I've been in several shops that have these, you want an automatic screen cleaning and reclaim system. It can make life a lot easier. You have chambers in something like this that is an inline. So step one, remove the ink. I mean, it's not much different than a manual. You have to remove the ink, and then you need that to be able to drip off the ink and the water. Um, Step three is it's actually power washed from both sides. So it's being power washed before emulsion remover is being applied? Is that correct, Keith?
Well, this particular machine that you've got up on here, it has an ink remover and brushes in it. And then it goes through a dwell period. And then it enters into the emulsion remover chamber, which is in the center there, with ink remover still on it.
Okay.
So the machine that we represent rinses in between. This particular one and most of them that are out there do not rinse in between. We chose a different direction with the company we partner with, and we don't want to cross-contaminate chemicals. And this topic is probably a little deep for the audience that we're probably going to have for this segment, but if you ever get into wanting more information about auto reclaim, just call me direct. I can guide you, or Zach and I can do a segment on auto reclaim if you want to do later, but that's an entirely new game, and you're not going to get one of these unless you're 100 to 150 screens a day.
They are. Everybody I've been in their shop, they will say that it's one of the best purchases they ever made. It was an auto reclaim for those bigger shops.
And the biggest reason, because it doesn't call into work.
Yes. It's so hard to find good employees nowadays, and then you'll have one and then leave and this thing.
Yeah, with automation, they scrape the ink out, they load it and press a button. They still have to detail and take the stain out and degrease them when they come out the other end, but it's a much cleaner, easier job to do than the initial 2 steps.
Yep. All right, Keith, that is our presentation. Again, like always, I always go longer than I thought it would. But I think this was very helpful to anybody who's thinking about getting into screen printing, or maybe you are one of those shops like myself who you learned some and then it's been working, but have you been doing it properly? Are you getting the best results? Are you battling the screens when you're reclaiming them? And again, things change over time. I mean, some of these chemicals they work differently than when you first enter the market, like myself. So it's why it's always valuable to be attending trade shows. Next week, very excited for the impressions. I think it's by far the best show of the year for apparel decorating. Keith is going to be there at the Saati booth. Highly recommend you check them out. And we at DecoNetwork have done multiple videos with Saati on screen reclaiming, the laser to screen system. So I will see you next week, Keith. Colin, do we have any questions? As always, I forgot to mention, submit your questions. I don't know if we have any, because again, I forgot to bring that up.
We have one and another one coming in a second from Paul.
Hit us
What
with the
I'm seeing is...
I think Christian answered most of his own questions. He wants to see a quotation for turnaround for 50 screens a day on reclaim. And Christian, if you're still listening, we have a process, and I would go to YouTube and look up Saati reclaim on YouTube, and it shows a 12-foot flat stainless steel table. That's what I normally recommend for people somewhere between 50 and 100 screens a day, because the process and technique that I helped develop is very fast, very efficient. And we rotate and work on about 6 screens at once, and it's very informative. So on YouTube, put in Saati reclaim, and you'll see yours truly doing a demo on a flat table. Or you could also put in just Saati flat table. Mind's Eye Graphics did a couple of segments on the flat table of theirs years ago. They're all still up there, and I send that link out at least 3 or 4 times a month, and the video is probably 10 or 12 years old.
Thanks, Keith. Where can someone purchase Saati chemicals? Because Saati doesn't sell direct, right? It's all through distributors.
Um, we try to support our dealers. And again, if somebody needs more information or where they can buy, Zach, you can put my contact information up if you'd like, my cell number and my email address. You guys are welcome to contact me, and I can tell you the closest couple of dealers in your area so that you can contact them both and get a quote. We have approximately 55 different dealers nationwide. Then there's also Saati Express. You can buy direct off the website, but there's multiple options.
And Keith did bring up a good point. Some dealers sell products for more money than others. You know, when my screen printer first was like, hey, I want to use these chemicals, and we went to one, and it was 30% more than another dealer. So great products at a really good price. Just you do sometimes want to compare. Not everybody sells the same product.
And to be honest, it's a matter of certain deal. There are dealers out there that might sell $600,000-$800,000 a year, so it's volume pricing. Some of them that sell 80 to let's say $80,000 a year, they may not get the same pricing for the guy that buys $800,000 a year. So yeah, he can offer you a better discount. We try not to get involved. We like to really push the dealers if we can. Some of the larger accounts here in the U.S. that we do sell direct because every other manufacturer is in there trying to sell direct, and it becomes not necessarily the better product out there with some of these people, but the pricing. And if you're stuck on the price per gallon, you got a rude awakening coming someday, because the quality of the product should be your focus. Yes. And with Saati, we get heavily involved with helping you choose the right product for what equipment you have, what you're trying to print, versus somebody selling you something $20 a gallon cheaper, and then you get it to press and it doesn't work at all. Well, I understand why it doesn't work, because that's designed for this type of inks. You're actually running these inks. That's where talking to an industry veteran, like some of the people we have on our staff, will understand the proper questions to ask you so that they can recommend the right product.
Wealth of knowledge. You get what you pay for, Keith.
So Paul Cook asked, are the Saati products available in the UK? And I will say yes. Yes, they are. I could get you a dealer or direct you to someone, but you probably could Google Saati distribution in the United Kingdom and probably get a list of 2 or 3. If you're unsuccessful, get a hold of Zach, and I will submit your information to Italy, who would contact that local sales rep or dealer, and they would reach out to you.
What about Australia? We have a lot of Australia users as well, Keith.
Hey, listen, I run from Mexico to Canada, coast to coast. I honestly don't have the knowledge at the top of my head who distributes and where they sell outside North America. But again, if you get me your information, I'll be glad to try to fill the void and get you the information needed.
Okay, we'll make sure when we share the webinar that we have your contact information. And again, so helpful. Do we have any other questions? Sounds like not, but questions pop into heads, Keith. So if it's all right with you, we'll share your information, and then you can get bombarded with emails and phone calls. And yeah, hopefully you can help some of us aspiring screen printers to reach our goals of doing all of this correctly and working smart and hard. You can just work hard, but if you're working smart, some of these things can become a lot easier. And again, things like reclaim, it's nobody's favorite job to do in the screen printing process. But if you're using the right chemicals and the right methods, you can often make something difficult become easier and better.
Absolutely. So I'd like to thank everybody that did tune in or is going to watch in the future. And if you happen to be attending the ISS Long Beach Imprinted Sportswear show next week, stop by booth 536 at Saati and come check us out. Cool.
We definitely will, Keith. And we're also going to share some of the other videos we made with Saati at the different trade shows, because you guys are always great at sharing information and always have some pretty cool toys too. Highly recommend anybody looking at stretching screens to check out Saati's screen stretcher. Keith, thank you so much for your time today and prepping this. We will see you in exactly a week at the Impression Show, and look forward to it.
All right, guys. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith.